At first, she walks away with a quiet sense of triumph. In her mind, the narrative is clear. She maintained control, protected her ego, and avoided vulnerability. To her, winning was never about connection. It was about dominance, about proving that she could detach before being hurt. And so she convinces herself that she has come out ahead. But what often goes unnoticed in these moments is that such victories are built on fragile ground. They are sustained not by truth, but by avoidance. Over time, the illusion begins to fracture. What once felt like power slowly reveals itself as emptiness, the absence of genuine connection. Something she may have dismissed as unnecessary starts to create a subtle, persistent void. This is where the psyche begins to shift. Because when the external noise fades, when there is no one left to control, impress, or outmaneuver, a person is inevitably confronted with themselves. And this is where the real tension begins. Not dramatic, not visible to others, but deeply internal. The mind, which once constructed a story of victory, starts to question its own conclusions. Was it truly strength to walk away without reflection, or was it a sophisticated form of escape? Carl Jung often spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. In moments like these, the shadow does not disappear. It waits, and in silence it speaks louder. What she thought was closure begins to feel unfinished. What she labeled as strength begins to resemble avoidance. And what she celebrated as a win slowly transforms into something far more complex, an unspoken awareness that something real may have been lost, not conquered. Because true victory does not leave you empty. It does not require self-deception to sustain itself. And if it does, then perhaps it was never a victory at all. What follows after that illusion of victory is far less glamorous than she anticipated, because what she relied on, often without fully understanding it, was a very specific kind of emotional supply. Not just attention, but depth. Not just presence, but genuine investment. And this is where reality begins to assert itself in a way that cannot be easily manipulated or reframed. At first, she assumes a replacement will be effortless. Another person, another connection, another source of validation. On the surface, it may even appear that way. Conversations continue, attention is received, and the external structure of connection seems intact. But something is different, and the difference is subtle, yet undeniable. The depth is missing. The emotional consistency, the patience, the willingness to truly see and understand her. It is not as readily available as she expected, because what she had before was not common. It is easy to underestimate something when it is consistently present. You begin to assume it can be replicated at will. But human connection does not work that way. Depth is not interchangeable. It is built over time through shared moments, emotional risk, and a level of sincerity that cannot be easily imitated. And so a quiet dissatisfaction begins to emerge. Not dramatic, not immediately acknowledged, but persistent. The attention she now receives feels thinner, less grounded. It lacks the substance she once took for granted. And this is where the psychological tension deepens, because now she is faced with a contradiction. She left in search of something better, yet what she encounters feels undeniably less. This realization does not always arrive consciously. Often it manifests as restlessness, as an inability to feel fully satisfied, despite having what she believed she wanted. And in that restlessness lies an uncomfortable truth, one that challenges the very decision she once felt so certain about. Because not all attention is equal. And when you lose something real, no amount of replacement can recreate its depth. And then something even more confronting begins to unfold. something she did not anticipate and likely tried to avoid altogether. Your absence, which she once perceived as insignificant or even empowering, starts to take on a very different psychological role. It becomes a mirror. When you were present, there was always movement, reactions, conversations, emotional exchanges. In that dynamic, it was easy for her to deflect, to project, to shift responsibility outward. There was always something to respond to, someone to influence, a narrative to control. But now, in your absence, that external focus disappears, and what remains is far more difficult to navigate. Because without distraction, the psyche turns inward. This is where the mechanism of projection begins to collapse. Carl Jung described projection as the act of assigning to others what we cannot accept within ourselves. It is a defense, a way of avoiding confrontation with our own patterns. But projection requires a target. And when that target is no longer available, when you are no longer there to absorb, react, or engage, the mind is left with its own unfiltered reflections. At first, this may appear as subtle discomfort, a sense that something feels unresolved. But over time, that discomfort deepens into awareness. Patterns begin to surface. Behaviors that were once justified start to look different when viewed without emotional interference. And this is not an easy process, because it requires a level of honesty that the ego resists. Your silence plays a crucial role here. Not as punishment, not as strategy, but as absence. And in that absence, there is no longer a way to rewrite the narrative in real time. There is only space. And in that space, truth has a way of emerging. Because when there is no one left to blame, no one left to convince, and no one left to convince, and no one left to control, a person is left with only one place to look. And what they see there can change everything. What begins to unsettle her even further is the gradual realization that control, the very thing she relied on most, is no longer available to her. Control, in this context, was never just about actions. It was about influence, the ability to shape emotional outcomes, to predict reactions, to maintain a certain psychological upper hand. And while it may have appeared effortless before, it was always dependent on one crucial factor: your participation. Now that participation is gone. At first, she may attempt to reestablish that sense of control in subtle ways, reaching out indirectly, testing boundaries, observing from a distance. These are not always conscious strategies, but rather instinctive responses to a loss of influence. Because when someone is accustomed to guiding the emotional direction of a connection, the absence of that ability feels disorienting. And this is where the internal tension intensifies. Without access to you, there is no feedback loop, no reactions to interpret, no emotions to manage, no responses to manipulate. The dynamic that once gave her a sense of certainty has been disrupted. And in its place is unpredictability, something the psyche often resists more than anything else. Control creates an illusion of stability. It allows a person to believe they understand the outcome, that they can anticipate what comes next. But when that illusion is removed, what surfaces is not just uncertainty, but vulnerability. And vulnerability, when it has been long avoided, can feel overwhelming. This is why the loss of control is not merely situational. It is psychological. It challenges identity. It forces a confrontation with the fact that power, as it was once understood, was never entirely self-contained. It depended on another person's presence, their engagement, their willingness to remain within the dynamic. And when that person steps away, the structure collapses. Because control is never as powerful as it seems when it relies on someone else to exist. The moment that dependence is exposed. What once felt like strength begins to reveal itself as something far more fragile. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, something begins to surface that cannot be controlled, redirected, or easily dismissed. It does not arrive with force or drama. It does not announce itself loudly. Instead, it emerges quietly, through moments of stillness, through passing thoughts, through memories that seem to appear without invitation. This is where regret begins to take shape. Regret is often misunderstood. People imagine it as an immediate reaction, a clear acknowledgement of loss. But in reality, it is far more subtle and far more persistent. It builds over time, layer by layer, as the mind revisits past experiences with a new perspective. What once felt justified begins to feel questionable. What once seemed insignificant starts to carry weight. She may begin to recall the consistency you offered, the patience you demonstrated, the way you remained present, even when it was difficult. And these memories are no longer filtered through the lens of control or emotional distance. They are experienced more honestly now, without the same defenses in place. And that honesty changes everything. Because with clarity comes contrast. The present is compared to the past, and in that comparison, something becomes evident. What she has now does not evoke the same depth. It does not feel as stable, as real, or as meaningful. And this is where regret deepens, not as a single realization, but as an ongoing awareness that something valuable was mishandled, perhaps even lost. Perhaps even lost. But here's the complexity of regret. It does not always lead to action. Sometimes it remains internal, unspoken, unresolved. The ego resists full acknowledgement, because to truly accept regret would mean confronting responsibility. And responsibility requires a level of humility that is not easily embraced. Yet the feeling does not disappear, because when you recognize, even quietly, that you let something genuine slip away, it stays with you. It lingers in the background, shaping your thoughts in ways you may not fully understand. And the truth is simple, though not always easy to accept. Some losses are not immediate. They reveal their significance only when it is far too late to undo them. And while all of this unfolds internally for her, quiet realizations, subtle discomfort, the slow emergence of regret, something equally significant, is happening on the other side of the equation. But this time, it does not revolve around her at all. It revolves around you. Because in her mind, the story likely ended with your collapse. She expected confusion, perhaps even desperation. She assumed your absence would be temporary, that eventually you would return, seeking closure or validation. But what she did not anticipate was transformation. When a person is removed from a dynamic that once drained them, something powerful becomes possible: clarity. And from clarity comes growth. You begin to see patterns you once tolerated, boundaries you once overlooked, and a version of yourself that had been quietly diminished. This awareness is not always comfortable, but it is necessary, because it shifts your focus from external validation to internal alignment. Over time, that shift becomes visible, not in exaggerated displays, but in subtle, undeniable ways. Your energy changes. Your decisions become more intentional. You no longer move from a place of reaction, but from a place of understanding. And perhaps most importantly, you no longer feel the need to prove your worth to anyone who failed to recognize it. This is where the true contrast emerges. Because while she may still be navigating the consequences of her choices, you are no longer defined by them. You have stepped outside the cycle. And that, more than anything, disrupts the narrative she once believed in. The idea that you would remain affected, that you would carry the weight of the past indefinitely. It no longer holds true. And when she becomes aware of this, directly or indirectly, it creates a moment of undeniable clarity. Not just about you, but about the reality she once dismissed, because the person she thought she left behind no longer exists. And in that realization lies a truth that cannot be reversed. Growth is the ultimate form of closure, and the strongest response to being underestimated is to become someone they can no longer reach.